Hey, thanks for stopping by. My name's Thomas, and this is Zarbo Audio Projects. In part one of this three-part series, we took a somewhat meandering look at how I designed the enclosure for this subwoofer project. In this video, part two, I'll show you in depth how I constructed and veneered these two identical enclosures. Well, these babies ain't gonna build themselves, so let's get to it. When it's time to start cutting wood for a project, I usually jot down the size of the enclosure with maybe a few notes on how many of each size panel I'll need. For this project, I'm making two enclosures simultaneously, so whatever number of panels I needed, I just doubled it. I decided to use miter joints as opposed to butt joints for this cabinet because a miter joint won't show any thickness changes underneath the veneer or paint. What can happen with a butt joint is, due to moisture changes over time, the end grain on a corner can move differently than the long side of the board, and it will show up usually as a raised portion, which becomes visible sometime after the paint or veneer is applied. Here's what that can look like over time. There are ways to get around this, but since a miter joint doesn't have any end grain, the entire surface of all the boards expands and contracts more or less uniformly. Miter joints may seem more difficult to do than butt joints, but they're actually pretty easy to get right as long as you have a good table saw and a square fence. I usually rough cut my boards to a slightly larger thickness and get the pieces to a more manageable size. And then I set up the miter angle on the saw and begin my final cuts. It's always best to arrange your cuts so you're changing the fence as little as possible. You'll notice that I did not miter the bottom of the cabinet. This design includes an interior brace the same size as the bottom panel. So it just sort of made sense to do both of these the same way. The next step is to get the vent pieces cut. I used 2-inch diameter black ABS plastic. The vent needs to be 14 inches long, and since the cabinet itself was only 14 inches long, I needed to add an elbow to get it to fit. I used a large radius 90-degree elbow, as opposed to the smaller one, to make the turn. I thought it might make for smoother airflow. The rule of thumb for determining a vent length that is not straight is to measure the length at the center point of the vent. You can do that with a string laid on the middle. The other rule of thumb for vents is that you want the exit of the vent to be at least 1 diameter away from any internal structure. With the port exit up high on the side of the cabinet, we have just enough room to fit the vent inside, but also enough space at the exit to avoid any weird turbulence issues. Now to cut out some holes in the brace for the vent, as well as adequate air pressure exchange inside the cabinet. I'll create the airflow holes at the drill press and the vent opening with the jigsaw, as I don't own a Fostering bit the same size as the vent. Next, I'll cut out the exit for the vent on the side of the cabinet. Everything fits real nice. Before assembling the vent pieces together, I used my small rotary sanding tool to radius the internal exit of the vent just a bit in the hopes of reducing turbulence. After scuffing the mating surfaces with sandpaper, I'll join the vent pieces permanently with 2-part epoxy. I just spread a bit on all the mating surfaces and fit it all together. Now we're ready to join the vent, brace, and back panel of the enclosure. I'm using epoxy to attach the vent and wood glue to attach the inner brace. Together, this makes up the vent assembly. Hey, wait a minute. That's not right. Do you see that right there? Yeah, I screwed that up. That's supposed to be well, let me just let him tell you about it. What I meant to do was cut this opening for this port here. like I did with this one, but I messed up. I gotta get this one to look like this. And how am I gonna do that? Well, let's take a walk over to the table saw and we'll see how I fix this mistake. This is how we're gonna fix this. I have here a 90-degree angle, which needs to be at a 45-degree angle. But one good thing I have going for me is this bottom part of this 90-degree angle is the correct height. So all I have to do is set my table saw for a 45-degree bevel, which I did, and then make sure that I don't cut any past to the very top of this. And that sounds like it's going to be hard, but it really won't be. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this sled, which is set at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular to the flow of the work on the table. I'm going to press it against this, and I'm going to make multiple passes, probably 2 or 3, until I can get this angle here exactly to where the termination is right at this corner here.
Well, that wasn't so bad. Cutting that piece of wood off left an angled gap on the bottom of that panel, but I just glued in one of the cutoff scraps from where I trimmed the excess off, and no one will ever know. Well, except for anyone who watches this video. Now it's time to glue up the enclosure. I did a dry fit first to make sure the joints were all nice and snug before slathering the wood glue on. And I'm using tape to clamp the enclosure together. It really works well. I do own strap clamps that I usually use for miter joint glue-ups like this, but I guess I felt like using tape this time. On a smaller enclosure, I'll sometimes tape the whole thing up before I apply glue to the joints. But since this is a bit larger, I'm gluing and taping as I proceed. Builder's choice, I guess. After the glue dried and I took the tape off, I gave the boxes a quick sanding on my homemade sanding board. This thing really comes in handy. Next up, cutting out the driver opening, giving the inside of that a bevel on the router table for some breathing room for the driver, and gluing in that bottom panel. Done. There's just a few more loose ends to tie up before we start talking veneer. So let's measure and mark the opening for the terminal cup, drill holes for the jigsaw, and cut the opening. Then let's mark, center punch, and drill the mounting holes for the driver. Oh, and I wouldn't be able to handle it if I forgot to drill the holes for the cabinet feet. As you can see, I built 2 of these subwoofers, and I thought I'd go with 2 different types of veneer for the finish: white birch and lacewood. The birch veneer is a good-looking, tight-grained wood that will be pretty easy to put a finish on. Just a few coats of polyurethane is all it takes to get it looking tip-top. The lacewood veneer, however, will take a bit more work. We'll discuss this more in the 3rd video, applying the finish. For now, let's get the pieces laid out and cut oversized so they can be glued on the cabinet.
What I think I'd like to do, and you think about this while you're doing it, is I would like the front of this, as you look at it, I would like you to look at the front of this box. See the veneer pattern go up like this, and then go over like this. It's going to be small down near the floor, and I think that's probably what's going to look the nicest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that part of one of these pieces of veneer, the top is connected to where the side is, and it just carries over. So if you do that right, it will look nice. With birch, there's not a whole lot of figure to the veneer, so it's not gonna matter a whole lot. But you will notice it. You might notice it if you're interested in stuff like that. And it's nice to do it when you can do it. This looks pretty good. Now the way I do the veneers, I use the heat lock method. That's where you apply glue to the piece and to the back of the veneer, let it dry until it basically stops being tacky and you iron it on. But the way I do it is I use blue painter's tape to tape the piece of veneer down as I'm rolling on the glue. So and you probably just want to leave a little room on the side. Some people cut the veneer like within 1/8 of an inch of the finished piece. I don't do that. I leave at least an inch, 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches if I can. So I'm just going to eyeball this, but I'm going to leave 3/4 of an inch. And you can't see what I'm doing because I'm behind the screen, or behind the speaker, but this is about, these are just rough sketches. The grain will continue on. I'll mark that. Front, I spelled front wrong. It's awful. Front and top.
Now I'll finish trimming out the pieces of the white birch, and then we can begin the glue up process. This is a fairly easy process to do. I'm applying the special heat lock veneer glue to both the cabinet and the back of the veneer with a 6-inch hard foam roller. Now you want an even coat, but you don't want to put it on too thick or it will take a long time to dry and it may dry unevenly. If that happens, just recoat with another thin coat and wait a bit more. I pour it in a plastic plate, then roll it from there, kind of like a paint tray. After I roll everything once, I usually hit the edges of the cabinets again with whatever glue is left in the plate. The edges seem to dry out faster for some reason, and a quick re-roll ensures that these areas have good adhesion for the long run.
I've turned the iron on. I have it set to between, like you can see that, between 5 and 6. Take my word for it. This one goes up to 7, 0 to 7. I have it set between 5 and 6. It's the steam setting. It's hot enough.
I usually wait for about a half hour or so and then check with my finger to see if it's still tacky. If my finger just barely sticks to it or doesn't quite stick to it, then I can place the veneer and begin ironing it on. Oh, and try to line up the panels as close as you can to where you want them before touching the two together. I find that sometimes I can move the veneer easily and other times it does want to stick a bit and stay put. Now that the veneer is placed on the cabinet, I can place my 100% cotton cloth on top of the veneer and iron it down. This is an old cotton t-shirt. To keep things moving, I'm gluing up 2 opposite sides at a time. Then I can trim them and do the other 2 panels. I'll repeat the same process for the lacewood veneer enclosures. After about a day to dry, I'll first cut the excess veneer off with a razor. Then I'll use the trim router with a flush cut bit to bring the veneer edge flush to the cabinets.
You can see all these hairs that are sticking out, the end grain of the birch veneer. Got to get that trimmed up. And the way to do that is just hit it with the sanding block so that all the fibers are aiming in one direction, and then we're going to sort of trim it like a scissors. We're going to go over and down. You see all these fibers, I just cut them off. It's kind of like using a scissors or a chop knife, except instead of a blade we're using sandpaper. Go this way. I'm using a fair amount of pressure, pressing in as I go. Chop those fibers off.
Now, as I feel with my finger, I notice that it feels flush with the cabinet. I'll just sand the sides flush and take a peek at that. Beautiful! The remaining veneer pieces on both enclosures are applied exactly the same way.
For the birch cabinet that has the back veneer, I'm going to crank the heat up to about 5.5 out of 7. It's going to take a minute or so to get up to temperature. Now for this, I'm going to pay a little extra attention to align the top to the front. Just a 32nd of an inch or so of overlap is all. pretty good. Give you a closer look. This grain line here kind of carries over a little bit. Yeah, it's not much, but it's always worth it to do your best. Now, if this was a situation where you just wouldn't notice at all, then it doesn't matter, but if you can, and if it'll show up even a little bit, it's worth trying it. If nothing else, you can say to your friends when you give them the subwoofer speaker, whatever it is, look, I matched the grain from the front over to the top. It's an experienced woodworker tip. I learned that from Zarbo Audio Projects. Yeah, tell them that. Tell them to subscribe and hit the notification bell and all that kind of stuff. I'm not telling you that. I don't do that. But I'm just telling you, if you do this and give somebody something with a tip that you learned, maybe just tell them that. Well, as you can see, we have a situation here. Of all the pieces of this lacewood veneer that I put on here, one of them cracked a little bit. Now, you can argue that I caused this crack when I used the iron to activate the glue to glue these pieces of veneer onto this box. However, that's really the only place where I had a crack. That was a particularly weak area of the veneer, and it had actually cracked pretty good before I even applied the piece of veneer to the box and ironed it. In fact, when it was still laying on the table after I ironed the glue on it, it had swelled up and created a crack before I even did anything with it. So this was bound to happen no matter what kind of glue you use, other than, say, contact cement. So this is how we're going to handle this. These have to be filled with something that somewhat resembles that grain and look and color. So this is how we're going to do it. I've already fixed this one up a little bit. That's just a little chip that happened as I was sanding. So I've masked everywhere except for that chip. And the reason you do that, and the reason I'm going to do it with this, is because what happens is, if you just apply this wood filler, and in this case I've got DAP plastic wood walnut colored filler, so you can get these in different colors so that they sort of match already what you're planning on finishing. But if you don't tape things off, and if you just let the filler go every place you apply the filler, you're going to have a different color of wood than the rest of the wood, and you don't want that. What we're trying to do is really disguise this application of wood filler so that it just appears like grain that you would normally see. The only really way to do that is to take the tape and hide the majority of the veneer. See, if I just applied it every place, it would look like I made a mistake, and we're trying to avoid looking like we made a mistake, even though, well, we didn't really make a mistake. At any rate, I hope you can see what I'm trying to do here, and I'm trying to talk as I do it, and you're probably not going to hear this because it's going to get edited out, without a doubt. But I'm trying to just cover up every place except where the crack is. That way, when I fill it with the grain filler, it won't look like anything but another piece of irregular grain pattern, which should look just fine.
I'm filling in those small cracks in the veneer with the color-matched wood filler, applying it with a putty knife.
Okay, let's get the rest of this tape off and see what it looks like.
Well, as much as we hate those little mistakes that happen, whether it's our fault or not, they do happen. And as far as this one goes, I'm pretty happy with how the repair looks. You can see it, but it won't draw attention to itself when the cabinet is finished, and that's what's important. All I need to do now is round over the port exit with my router and give the cabinets a final sanding. Then we'll be ready to apply the finish.
Now that the cabinets are physically constructed and veneer has been applied, All that's left to do now is to choose a finish for each one of these cabinets. I've already done that, obviously, but since I went with 2 different veneer species, the steps and techniques that I use for each are different as well. So in the final video in this series, I'll show you the 2 different ways I handled applying a protective finish on each of these subwoofer cabinets. So please stay tuned for that. Well, I have a few more thoughts to share after this quick outro, but it's been like 21 minutes or so, and you might have some personal things to attend to, so feel free to duck out if you need to. Otherwise, I'll see you in a few seconds. I've always looked at these types of videos on YouTube as instructional, and as such, I think they should include the pertinent information on how to do a particular task. I'm hoping that my approach and the little smattering of dry humor that I inject makes it somewhat enjoyable to watch as well. But although a 10-minute video that shows you how to make a Bluetooth speaker from start to finish, where nobody says a word and there's absolutely no explanation of why anything's being done, might get 2 million views, how much have you really learned at the end of the video? Ask yourself that. Anyway, ran over, and if you're still with me, thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye now.